There are two ways that neurons can communicate, or mainly two ways. Anytime you hear about these GPCRs or G protein coupled receptors, pay attention because they're really interesting. So that's a description of what we would call the spatial effects or the spatial aspects of dopamine. I said this connects to that connects to this. You can get local or more broad volumetric release. What about the duration of release or the duration of action for dopamine? Well, dopamine is unique among chemicals in the brain because dopamine, unlike a lot of chemicals in the brain, works through what are called G protein coupled receptors. And for those of you that are about to pass out from the amount of detail, just hang in there with me. It's really not complicated. There are two ways that neurons can communicate, or mainly two ways. There are a third and a fourth, but mostly neurons communicate by two modes. One are what we call fast electrical synapses, ionotropic conduction. All right, you don't need to know what that means, but basically one neuron activates another neuron and little holes open up in that neuron and ions rush in. Sodium is the main ion, salt, by which one neuron influences the electrical activity of another neuron because sodium ions contain a charge. Okay, there are other things like chloride and potassium. If you're interested in looking this up, just look up ionic conductances in the action potential, or I could do a post on it sometime and we could go into detail, but just understand that when neurons want to influence each other, they can do it by way of this fast ionotropic conduction. This is a really quick way for one neuron to influence the next. Dopamine doesn't communicate that way. Dopamine is slower. It works through what are called G protein coupled receptors. So what happens is dopamine is released in these little vesicles that I mentioned before, get vomited out into the synapse. Some of that dopamine will bind to the so-called postsynaptic neuron. It'll bind to the next neuron, and then it sets off a cascade. It's kind of like a bucket brigade of one thing getting handed off to the next, to the next, to the next. It's G protein coupled receptors. And anytime you hear about these GPCRs or G protein coupled receptors, pay attention because they're really interesting. They're slow, but they also can have multiple cascades of effects. They can impact even gene expression at some level. They can change what a cell actually becomes. They can change how well or how poorly that cell will respond to the same signal in the future. So dopamine works through this slower process, these G protein coupled receptors. And so its effects tend to take a while in order to occur. This aspect of dopamine transmission is important because it now underscores two things. One, there's two pathways for dopamine to communicate, one for movement, one for motivation and craving. There's two spatial scales at which dopamine can operate, synaptically or volumetrically, and dopamine can have slow effects, really slow effects, or even very long-lasting effects. And it even can control gene expression. It can actually change the way that cells behave.